Van harte welkom hier in het Kraakhuis van muziekcentrum de Bijloke. Very warm welcome to everybody here in our chamber music hall, the Kraakhuis of Music Center de Bijloke. Van harte welkom dus op deze lounge, deze lancering van een nieuwe website. Het is voor mij de allereerste keer dat ik dit mag doen, een lancering van een website openen. Ik ben zeer vereerd. Dark van Eyck, een zeer intrigerende titel voor een website. Het is een online archief met materiaal van kunsthistoricus Gerard van Acker, maar ook een nieuw kunsthistorisch platform, als ik dat zo mag zeggen, dat ons denken en ons kijken op Van Eyck probeert te luchten, zal ik maar zeggen. Normaal gezien zou deze activiteit plaatsgevonden hebben in ons café en had u een drankje erbij gekregen, maar dat kan dus omwille van de maatregelen dus niet. Wat betekent dat we dus naar hier zijn verhuisd en ik wil u er dan ook aan herinneren dat u ook verplicht bent om de hele tijd ook uw mondmasker op te houden. We hebben een aantal internationale sprekers. Het evenement wordt ook live gestreamd op dit moment. Dus we gaan straks verder onze conversatie verder zetten in het Engels. Nu in elk geval niet getreurd. De lezingen of de artikels waarnaar verwezen wordt, die zullen ook beschikbaar worden gesteld in twee talen op die website. Misschien nog niet allemaal meteen. Het is een website in progress, dus dat zal mettertijd ook wel ter beschikking gesteld worden. Eventjes het korte verloop van deze avond. Ik ga eerst het woord geven aan Björn Schmelzer, artistiek leider van GRAINDELAVOIX en ook de bezieler van de nieuwe website Dark van Eyck. Daarna volgen 3 voordrachten die Björn ook kort zal toelichten. 3 sprekers, Andrew Hallock, Tim Foubert en Joanna Gomes. Daarna gaan we een kort gesprekje doen, Björn en ik, over de website en het potentieel daarvan. En als er dan nog tijd rest, dan gaan we nog een korte Q&A doen. Nu in elk geval, ik ga zeker de klok in de oog houden. We gaan afsluiten om 10 uur. Niet omdat we dat per se willen, maar omdat er ook een avondklok is. En ik zou niet willen dat u straks niet alleen naar huis gaat, compleet geïnspireerd, maar ook nog met een boete naar huis zou gaan. Dus dat gaan we niet aan u verlappen. Nog één, ik ga het straks ook nog eens zeggen, maar dus als het gedaan is, iemand moet pipi doen of zoiets, ren niet meteen naar buiten. Het zaalpersoneel zal u naar buiten begeleiden op een veilige manier. And now I'm giving the floor to Björn Schmelzer, artistic leader of GRAINDELAVOIX, who is going to launch the new website. Geef hem een hartelijk applaus, alsjeblieft.
Thank you very much. So, as already announced by Tom, our host here of the Bijloke, I will talk in English. I hope that's okay. My English is Belgian English, so also for the people at home, don't be afraid. In fact, we have only one really native speaker among our guests. That will be high level. The rest will be just, let's say, Belgian style, which is a great thing, by the way. Maybe just to tell you something very quickly, we in fact worked till 2 minutes ago on this launch. We had still things to correct and so on, and still there are little things to correct, so I'm a little bit improvising, but why not? You don't have to always exactly know what you say. So Dark van Eyck is a project which is linked on the work of one man, a bit of forgotten figure, Gerard van den Acker. And we started with already editing 2 of his texts, which will be still explained by Joanna, are really scattered. We had to really almost compose them, construct them. Anyhow, we can also afterwards talk about what dark Van Eyck really means. Why is it dark Van Eyck? There is no painter so luminous, so colorful, you would say, as Van Eyck. So why dark Van Eyck? Maybe also if you're already on the website, because he's already online now. So if you're home and you look, you have this weird logo there. It's a little bit explained in the About page, but somehow it's a quite interesting thing. It was something that Gerard found very important, this logo. That was, it's in fact a logo of, you could almost say, of Van Eyck himself. It was a little graffiti that he put on the back of the wall of the Arnolfini painting. When he says Johannes de Eyck fuit hic in Latin, Jan van Eyck was here. And then there is this little sign there that in fact was a little bit neglected in scholarship. Like, what is this little sign that is there? It's like a point, a punctum, but is it a point? Is it something else? That were questions that Gerard could really chew on for months, sometimes for years, and he completely infected us with this chewing, let's say, chewing way of doing art history. It's like called ruminatio, you know, what cows do and animals. So, and we were infected by that a little bit. So, anyhow, I will stop because the time is short and we have a lot to talk about. Also, a lot to reveal. We are so thrilled. Maybe I look, for once in a while, not that nervous, but I'm really, really terribly nervous, just also because of the thrill of what we're gonna tell you. There will be 3 speeches. The first I will announce maybe the first, and in between I will give you a little bit more explanation or information about the 2 other speakers. The first is, it's a partner in crime of me, a fellow artist who is also a singer of GRAINDELAVOIX, Andrew Hallock, also a man of a lot of we say in Flemish something like 12 stijl en 13 ongeluk, maar dat klinkt niet mooi. It's a guy of a lot of capacities, let's say, a man of all seasons. And he was already there in Areolus, in the summer school of Jan van Eyck, that was organized in 2012 from the first time. So he was there from the beginning, and he will, in fact, explain and propose to you the first article that we put online. There are 2 articles already online, and they are, by the way, Tom, they are already in both languages, so they are both available in English and in Dutch. Yeah, French and so on, maybe that can still come later then. But voilà, let's start, Andrew, and he will explain himself what he's going to talk about. I think we can go already to the title of the thing. These are the 2 articles, and then, of course, there it is. This is the first article, and that's a little bit the design of the website. It's not really dark. So where is this darkness? Maybe we should talk about that, no? But voilà, let's start. And I propose that questions will be for completely in the end. So not to get out of the drive, we have the 3 speakers. Afterwards, there is the talk, and then there is possibility to still ask some questions. Thank you very much, and enjoy this 2 hours. By the way, 21st of October, it's St. Ursula Day. For the real aficionados of Van Eyck, they had to be here or at home. I mean, it will be like the Bloomsday. From now on, 21st of October, I think we all go on pèlerinage to Ghent and Bruges, and maybe to Areolus. And voilà, please enjoy.
Hi, thank you, Björn, for that introduction. I'm Andrew, and I'm going to read bits and pieces of the first text from the website for you today. It's really a pleasure to be here today with you, especially considering the special significance of October 21st. Now, just to start out with, I'm no scholar on this matter, just an enthusiast, but I have to say Gerard van den Acker's work has added depth to my own musical work, which would simply not be there otherwise. In fact, little did I know then how much life can change. I was still a student of composition and singing back in 2012, when I attended the summer school in Areolus and met Gerard for the first time. Now my work is mostly tied up in Franco-Flemish polyphony, singing and working with the original sources and notation. So naturally, I'm especially interested in all of those overlooked signs, ciphers, symbols, anagrams that are sprinkled through this repertoire, both musical and visual. And so it's with that in mind that I'd like to read now bits and pieces from Gerard's article on the Lael Souvenir portrait today. This that I'm about to read will be the first text launched on the website. The very patient team, who is still even collating, writing, editing all the fragments that Gerard left to us, has done a remarkable job, I think. Thank you. So here it is, a brand new edited text about the sitter of the so-called Lael Souvenir portrait, also known as the Timotheus portrait of Van Eyck that sits in the National Gallery in London, probably his first portrait ever. And here already in the title itself, we start with enigmas in the name of the sitter. Lael Villain. A name which I guess will not ring a bell, although for people steeped in Bruges history, the figure appears not to be completely unknown. Digging a bit through the records, Lael Villain happens to be the name of a sodomite burnt at the stake in 1432. The unbelievable hypothesis then that it was to this pitiful person that Jan van Eyck dedicated his most likely first portrait, an epitaph, a commemoration for a person who was condemned to die in anonymity without leaving any trace. But enough from me and my spoilers, let's get to the article. So here what follows is just a summary since we don't have all day, but I would urge you to explore the whole thing online, starting now, tomorrow, or tonight, if you simply can't wait. Our text starts quite poetically with a description of the sitter by Johann Huizinga, who calls the sitter an Egyptian mystery, and how subsequent scholars somehow continued with this intuitive impulse to hold the sitter at arm's length, estranging him. We start. Egyptian mystery, according to the legendary Dutch historian Johann Huizinga, is the quality that radiates from the sitter in a Jan van Eyck portrait now held in the National Gallery in London. The work bears the painter's signature and the date 10th of October 1432, preceded by the past participle actum. This word choice has reminded multiple researchers of a notarial or legal deed rather than a painting. It seems as if the sitter, who holds a parchment scroll, has just emerged from the darkness and positioned himself against a low wall. In reality, the wall is a trompe-l'œil, a painting of a weathered stone parapet on which the inscription Lael Souvenir has been chiseled, so to speak, in 12th century Roman-style capitals. In the volatile, sketchy manner of graffiti, and with the same white paint as the date and signature at the bottom, is the word Timotheus. The image leans towards transience and melancholy. There is the gaze of the sitter with his subtly tearful eyes. There is also the broken stone, a remnant of classical antiquity with its hermetic, almost erased traces, signs, and inscriptions. Did any artist before Van Eyck reconcile the ruinous classical past in such a way, using it as decor? The design is inspired by Roman epitaphs and tombstones, which often showed the deceased in a similar way, in a niche behind a balustrade bearing informative inscriptions. So, we have a silent sitter, a verbose parapet, all of that jumbled text stressing the duality between the sitter who is dead but seems to be alive, and the stone, inanimate yet screaming with information. So, I quote, "Is this frame, this ruined parapet with its crooked inscriptions and lowly graffiti, this plump, gaudy trompe-l'œil with its exaggerated comic mixture of registers and languages, French and Roman or Romanesque, capitals, juridical Latin and Gothic bastarda letters in italics, a Greek rebus in capitals and small letters, is it just an ornament, a carrier of a message? Is it a statement by the artist, a kind of manifesto, both conceptual and meta, or is it a cryptic commentary on the sitter's private or public life, his poetics or destiny?" Not enough emphasis has been placed on the virtuoso semiotics at play here. A semiotics which, on closer inspection, when examined in all its subtlety, taking into account the absurd Babylonian combinations on display, is also absolutely comical. Above, a man locked in silent contemplation. Below, a broken stone babbling excessively in multiple tongues. In between, a rolled-up, illegible text. But has the last word been spoken? Perhaps it is this mysterious stratification, this strange economy of signs that makes the observer unable to forget the image, torn as they are between the unintelligibility of the stone that is lifeless but cries out, and the sadness of a man whose message is mute. Then follows a rather descriptive passage about the gaze of the sitter, the dead look in the eyes, etc., etc. And then we get to the meat of the article, where the text engages with Erwin Panovsky's canonical reading of the painting in his 1949 article, Who is Van Eyck's Timotheus? Panovsky's assertion that the sitter must be the Franco-Flemish polyphonist Gilles Banchois, court composer of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. In fact, that's certainly what we learn and are taught in music history classes, that this is the portrait of Banchois. But we don't really have any solid evidence of that. In fact, there's a kind of default assumption here that portraits should be important people, at least as important as the painter has become to us. What follows is Gerard's critique of Panovsky, rather his royal road of art history. Now we get to the crux of the article, which starts from Panovsky's claim that Timotheus on the parapet must be the ancient Greek composer Timotheus of Milete. So here we agree with Panovsky, but for surprising reasons. Not because Timotheus of Milete was famous in the Middle Ages, but because he was infamous. Let me read. Typical for the master discourse on Panovsky's brand of art history is the importance placed on the revelation of the identity of the sitter, an act that reduces meaning to biographical or contextual detail, ignoring an artwork's operation. The unknown sitter always turns out to be someone of stature, as if painting of the caliber of Van Eyck's would only lend itself to portraying a grandee, finding its articulation and confirmation in the subject's social standing. History and art history make a perfect marriage in this kind of discourse, with the latter contributing to the illustration of the glorious past and its glorious representatives. Simply put, the art historical importance of the portrait is equal to the historical importance of the portrayed. Van Eyck is a servant of that importance, and this is why his work matters. No image is wasted on what will not stand the test of time. This is why the idea of Van Eyck as a state painter is so well received. The state monitors and guarantees the artist's works, ensures that he makes state artworks by producing portraits of important persons in its employ. Or is there another understanding? According to Panovsky, Gilles Banchois was such a person, an innovative composer and a loyal state servant, and for this reason Van Eyck paints Timotheus on the parapet, invoking none other than Timotheus of Miletus, inventor of Greek music and court composer to Alexander the Great, whom the Burgundian Duke Philip the Good, in all his megalomania, likened to compare himself to. In his 1953 classic, Early Netherlandish Painting, written 4 years after his article on Timotheus, Panovsky sums up the incestuous relationship between the state and the arts as follows. To glorify Philip's court musician as the new Timotheus thus meant to glorify Philip himself as the new Alexander, and incidentally, Jan van Eyck as the new Apelles. Continuing with the Van Acker. The fact that the latter title was given to Van Eyck by Karel van Mander in the early 17th century and is therefore completely beside the point does not seem to be a problem for Panovsky. It is thought-provoking that the marriage between historical art production and state ideology is adopted as a seamless axiom. Someone like Van Eyck apparently produces art that fully corresponds to the symbolic order of his time, even more, that contributes to its very construction. Historicist analysis must do nothing but map out the socio-cultural networks of which art is the perfect reflection. The fact that art historians have proved so keen to conceive of ancient artworks as flawless representations of the contemporary symbolic and ideological order is an idea that should itself be subject to criticism. But let's dwell a moment on Timotheus of Miletus. Panovsky is right to associate the name on the parapet with the musician of ancient times. Other hypotheses, such as an association with the Greek sculptor Timotheus of Epidaurus, mentioned by Pliny, must be rejected for reasons which will become clear below. However, Timotheus of Miletus must remain in the frame for reasons diametrically opposed to those that motivate Panovsky, i.e., not because of his fame, artistic achievements, and connection to the court of Alexander the Great. Moreover, it is not even historically correct to say that Timotheus of Miletus was known for such reasons in the Middle Ages. Besides Boethius, Panovsky and followers hardly cite any source from Van Eyck's time or before. The reason why Timotheus of Miletus was known in the Middle Ages instead has to do with his infamous reputation, which can be compared to some extent with that of the philosopher Socrates, namely that he was a spoiler and seducer of youth. This description figures in De Institutione Musica by Boethius, an eminently popular medieval text which provides the most important historical description of Timotheus. The curious thing is that Panovsky himself quotes this description but does not comment on it. We quote Panovsky quoting Boethius in his famous 1949 article. Do you have the text? In Plato's opinion, the state must carefully watch out that music be well-behaved and chastely harmonious, so as to be modest, simple, and masculine, and not effeminate, nor wild, nor varied. This rule was faithfully observed by the Spartans as long as Thaletas from Gornia on Crete, called to the city at great expense, instructed their boys. For such had been the custom of the ancients, and it stayed for a long time. But when Timotheus, the Milesian, proceeded to add one more string to those which he had found before, and rendered music more complex, it was resolved to expel him from Laconia, which resolution I have appended in its original Greek words. The burden of this resolution is that Spartans had waxed indignant at Timotheus the Milesian because in rendering music complex, he harmed the souls of the boys entrusted to him for instruction and kept them away from the sobriety of virtue. And because he had perverted harmony from its previous mode to the chromatic mode, which was too soft. Continuing with the Van Acker, a 14th century paraphrase of this text has survived, in which Johannes Hollandrinus tries to prove the damaged, perverse nature of the chromatic genus. It confirms the dismissive medieval Orthodox view of Timotheus, going so far as to accuse him of sodomy, an accusation that could already be read between the lines in the original Boethius. Quote, "Chromatic music is that which is measured through the fourth, which proceeds by minor semitones. That is to say, between the first and second strings, 3 semitones sound, but between the second and third, 1 semitone sounds. The inventor of this music is said to have been a Milesian, who, by his wonderful and sweet-sounding singing, made young men effeminate, and thus induced them into sexual activities, for which reason he was thrown out of and expelled from Athens." End quote. Timotheus of Miletus made men effeminate and seduced them into venereal acts, which of course means that he incited men to perform unnatural sex or sodomy, a mortal sin in the Middle Ages and one that supposedly caused extreme harm to the public order. This would have set alarm bells ringing amongst those able to read the name Timotheus in Greek letters in Van Eyck's painting. Continuing with the Van Acker, I claim that the person Van Eyck portrayed was not an innovative composer, and that Timotheus is written on the parapet precisely because of the bad reputation which the ancient musician has been saddled with since the Middle Ages. There is eminent proof for this in the form of the rebus that Van Eyck creates by transcribing the name in an unusual way. not as it would normally appear, namely in one go and in all capitals. So let's take a moment to look at the Van Eyck, if it's possible. Can we somehow confirm any of these speculations? Are there clues in the portrait itself that point us in this direction, namely this particular interpretation of the word Timotheus? And also, of course, why is that word even here to begin with? It needs a pretty good reason, no? This connection to a musician from classical antiquity. Let's go back to the text. The name of the person portrayed is not hidden, but rather deliberately omitted, and Van Eyck replaces or substitutes him with Timotheus, perhaps to be able to speak of a person whose name cannot or must no longer be mentioned. I'm not convinced that the name of the sitter was on the original lost frame, as is the case with Van Eyck's portraits of Margarida van Eyck and Jan de Leeuw. I also believe that the identity of the person portrayed was unknown to the uninitiated, to the accidental guest, to the casual spectator, that the true identity of the person portrayed had to be jealously concealed because the sitter himself became so unnameable, having committed the unnameable crime, the so-called crimen nefandum. It would suffice to say of ancient Timotheos, let he who can understand. Timotheos is therefore an alias, such as the broken stone of the parapet that reveals but also envelops or conceals, borrowed from an ancient artist who, according to tradition, has committed the sin of sodomy. Or what else do you call a bending and unnecessarily complicated art that is supposedly simple and natural in origin, but that confronts and contaminates the youth, warping their supposedly natural disposition and inciting them to unnatural acts? Timotheus must have been more than just a name to Van Eyck himself. Perhaps he was the true, albeit secret, patron of the artist, who was then hard at work creating an irreparable rift in the traditional so-called organic harmony between the cosmos and earthly existence. What Van Eyck stages in the portrait is the central problem of modernity, the primordial myth of which can be situated in antiquity of degenerate art that retroactively evokes the dream and desire for so-called pure natural art. It seems to the authors as if Van Eyck inaugurated this moment with a ruined, broken stone and with the portrait of a man whose name could not be mentioned, a martyr, depicted as Timotheos, patron saint of degenerate sodomite artists. Okay, wow. That's a lot to swallow, as it were. Let's take a breath. There's the notion of camouflage here, something being disguised, censored, a pseudonym, an alias, a trail of breadcrumbs for the initiated. And now next we have, on top of everything else, a little riddle. Why this small, tiny omega? And in fact, why omegas everywhere? Here's what Gerard has to say. But what is a lost omega? An omega without the camouflage of other Greek letters. Think of a rebus, wherein each character is coded individually regardless of its context. Wherein letters, drawings, symbols, and diagrams are used interchangeably. What if the painter gives a clue as to the decoding of the inscription with that omega, but it is hard to understand because it is perceived as an inappropriate intrusion of the obscene into a pictorial context that seems much more sublime? At the same time, it is like a dark, cryptic joke that painfully approaches the situation of the person portrayed. The trickster painter knows that the canonical exegete can think of anything except what he does not want to see, which he cannot see. Again, as I have stated elsewhere, the real is visible only according to the viewer's position and discourse. For example, a minuscule omega pops up between all capital letters, a letter that is not actually a letter, but camouflage. The exegete has no doubts that it is an omega, especially in an inscription otherwise consisting of Greek letters. But the exegete should sound an alarm at the sight of so many omegas scattered around the stone and think, the painter wants me to believe that that is an omega. But why not make it big like the other capitals? Because it is about the pictorial value of the omega, of course, a pictorial value that is lost in the capital. But this requires the observer to approach the omega as a pictogram, and at the same time it produces a rupture in the semiotic register that the subject seems unable to accept. However, ask anybody on the street what's suggested by this, and the answer will be forthcoming. A but. It's that simple. Van Eyck paints a but between the Greek capitals and says, here's the clue, read this backwards. Do a reading a tergo. And what you read will have formal and substantive meaning. The two intertwined. This backward reading, of course, a sodomitical reading, backwards copulation as a model for backwards reading. The 12th century philosopher Alain de Lille has exhaustively explained the rules of this sodomitical grammar in his influential satire De Planctu Nature. Hieronymus Bosch, to name but one, is of course a more explicit practitioner of that grammar than Van Eyck. So let's do it. Let's neglect the full stop because it has no meaning except that Van Eyck meant it to obscure the possibility of our retrograde reading, and Timotheus, and backwards becomes a medieval man whose mother tongue was Middle Dutch would have understood this word immediately. Perhaps the contemporary reader needs some additional help. What we see is this letter is, of course, the capital sigma, which one reads as S, as in Van Eyck's motto, Als ik kan. The OE in the Middle Dutch variant is the modern long O, so OE is O, so we have so, and then th or theta, which can of course be read as D, as in theos, deus, so we have sod, we're starting to understand here. The omega is of course read as O, so sodo, and finally the Latin letters MYT, which don't need any further explanation, which produces sodomite. So, after all this little breakdown of the word and its retrograde, we have a little section on the relevance of sodomy in the 15th century of Bruges. It goes on and on with details, which you can find on the website. Mostly this focuses on an article by Professor Marc Bon about how Burgundy repressed sodomy in this period more ferociously to gain state power and control over such an otherwise independent city as Bruges. Now, about Louis Villain, one of those names listed in the Bruges bailiff accounts, accused of sodomy and burned at the stake in 1432, around the 20th of September. His name, Louis Villain, is perhaps hiding inside Lael Souvenir, looking out at us from behind its camouflage. Here's how to find it. Look for a moment at the Roman capital R. Notice that directly above it is a crack in the parapet, splitting the letter into two parts. I plus a sideways distorted omega, which is a common scribal abbreviation. We see this all the time, this letter M at the end turns sideways in Ockeghem, Obrecht, Dufay. The remaining A and E could eventually, with an added V, mean something like Ave Louis Villain, or AE, which points at his age, which can also be read in the inscription as 24 years old. Just to lay the groundwork for what comes next in Gerard's writing, it was the legendary Elizabeth Danans who proposed a link between Timotheus and the Gent Villain family, as she read Timotheus in Latin, Time Deum, which is the motto of the Villain family. Her assertion was rejected by Panovsky and others and never really looked into. Maybe it needs to be. Okay, continuing with Van den Acker. Who is this Louis Villain? Except the certain fact that he was labeled a sodomite and burned at the stake in Bruges, nothing is known about him. Or is it? In his 1995 article, The Sitter for Van Eyck's Lael Souvenir, Jacques Pavillot proposes an interesting hypothesis, which, as with Danen's Time Deum theory, subsequently foundered for lack of further evidence. Moreover, Paviot had a second hypothesis, which he considered more likely, namely that the portrayed was a member of the Chamber of Rhetoric of Tournai. It is time to revisit Paviot's initial hypothesis. According to his initial hunch, Paviot suggests that the person portrayed must have been a writer or clerk living in Bruges, in particular the first clerk of the newly established First Bruges Chamber of Rhetoric of the Holy Spirit, an extremely important cultural association under the impetus of late Jan van Eyck, a poet best known for his contribution, Gruitische manuscript, a Middle Dutch collection of love poems from Bruges around the year 1400. Paviot's argument is as simple as it is to the point, revolving around three crucial elements. It is based on the meaning of the scroll that the sitter holds and on the notarial or judicial tenor of the Latin sentence with which the painter signs the parapet. In the light of what we know now to have been Louis Villain's fatal end, his arrest and execution, it takes on a further bitter aftertaste. I skip down a little bit, just to keep things moving. For Paviot, such a person is more likely to have been in Van Eyck's entourage, and more specifically to have been amongst the 13 members of the Bruges Chamber of Rhetoric of the Holy Spirit, founded in 1428. Those names are a matter of public record. Some were prominent Bruges traders with artistic ambitions, some professional visual artists and writers. The name of the first clerk of the society is written at the end, Losse Luike. Paviot concludes, the new guild had a first clerk, Losse Luike. If he was still in charge in 1432, he may have been the sitter for Lael Souvenir. So, I think Björn will still talk about the implications of all this. It is also exhaustively explained in the article. The idea that Louis Villain would be the same man as Losse Luike is further explored in the article, which you can read. I guess what emerges here is a strange and unexpected new perspective on the portrait. Bonn ends his pivotal text on the sweeping repression of sodomites in the 15th century, Bruges, as follows. Although many concerning the social history of Bruges, although many questions concerning the social history of Bruges still need to be studied, the tragic fate of the 90 Bruges sodomites invites us to reconsider the splendor of the Burgundian theater state in Bruges. Seen in the light cast by the burning stakes, its cracks and tarnishes are visible. And finally, returning to the Van den Acker. One of those 90 sodomites now has his name back and his face, which was not unknown, though no one knew the tragedy that hid the souvenir of his tombstone. Only a trickster painter like Van Eyck could have simulated a grave more durable than stone, which for 600 years has remained faithful to the memory of Louis Villain, the sodomite who died at the stake and had to do without a grave. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We continue immediately with the second speaker, who is there on my right, Tim Foubert, who is one of the oldest friends of Gerard. He was also helping hand in the last phase of his life. I will think some elements are also on the. You can find some elements on the side also about that. So he has also, he is an art collector and so on. He doesn't also want that I go too much into the detail about all this, but anyhow, he has a very interesting second text to introduce to you. I don't know if it looks promising. For me, I'm still in great excitement. So let's listen to Timothy, what he has to say. This is about two major paintings, the Turban, the Chaperone, the Chaperone self-portrait of Jan van Eyck, and then the portrait of the goldsmith Jan de Leeuw. Please, your attention for Tim.
Thank you, Björn. It's nice to be here again in Ghent, and so thank you very much. On this particular day, the 21st of October, a very special day. I will introduce the second text of tonight. So again, a lot of information will come available on the website, or already is, and this is one that speaks particularly to me. So, L'histoire de l'œil, the hole and the stain in the two portraits by Jan van Eyck. Essay starts with a very simple observation, which concerns the date of today, 21st of October. The date connects, in fact, two portraits by Jan van Eyck, appearing on two different paintings. First time, on the assumed self-portrait, we read the date 21st of October, 1433, and the second time, on the 1436 portrait of Jan de Leeuw, written as Sant Ursulendag, or the day of the feast of Saint Ursula, which of course is the 21st of October. More specifically, as the verses on the frame tell us, this date is also the birthday of Jan de Leeuw. Is this a coincidence? Scholars seem to assume it, as this correspondence has never really been questioned or studied. Our text takes this apparent triviality as a starting point. I say our because it is clear that the collective works of Van den Acker are also a collective activity, from collecting, writing, editing, supervising, etc. And this reminds me of the good times I had with Gerard. Strangely enough, it was his Einzelgänger who engaged us once again in this collective operation of art history. I would just like to introduce you to the article and read some parts in order to get the Van Acker touch, as we used to call this typical style and approach. The structure of the essay is rather simple. First, the two paintings are scrutinized by what he called his aberrant machine of sort of close reading against the grain. As everything could be regarded as reading possibilities, in the end, Van den Acker strikes a blow by ending with irrefutable proof, which is, as we already announced, another of his decodings. This time the plus and the dot, the point, riddle, with which Van Eyck decorated the frame of the painting of Jan de Leeuw. And I will tell you some more of this at the end. So let's start with the beginning, the self-portrait. And I'm convinced that the online essay will even bring more evidence that is effectively a self-portrait. The essay focuses first on the unprecedented glance of the sitter, what Panovsky called the look out of the picture, looking directly at the viewer, because of course the depicted as the painter looks primarily to himself in a mirror in order to be able to paint himself. Here the classical self-consciousness, Here the classic self-conscious Renaissance gaze is often mentioned, and the dialogue of glances between viewer and painted subject. Yet what the article is pointing at are elements that already, quite from the start, seem to disturb this nice dialogue, this va-et-vient of glances, this pure exchange which constitute the subject in control. First, of course, there is the excessive turban, which takes so much unnecessary space of the painting. But there is more, and this more, which we will see is also a less, will be of crucial importance for the connection with the Jan de Leeuw painting. So what about this turban, of course, correctly called a chaperone, as it was called. I don't know any Van Eyck article which deals in such detail qua description, but also qua meaning with this headgear. And against functionalist readings or readings that focus on the reality principle, the enemy for Van Acker, the anecdotal daily reality before the painting and the exclusion of fantasy, the chaperone is called the signifier of the dysfunctional. I quote, "In the appearance of an inane but overblown fascinium, not even a gestalt, but merely a tied-up piece of scarlet, the turban is of course perfectly suited to take on the role of a phallus. A showpiece on the head of the proud painter, the red chaperone stands as a mascot of his trade, a proof of self-importance and self-affirmation, as various researchers have rightly argued. This is of course only half the truth of a phallus, and the painter knows it. The initial experience of awe gives way to the opposite, and the viewer understands the comical nature of this headgear. The glance of the subject turns into a mocking smile at his own ridiculous posture. The image's initial seriousness and sovereign truth are transformed into an almost absurd spectacle. Are the numerous modern pastiches and parodies of this immortal image of Van Eyck with this term not proof that the representation is intrinsically amusing? This deals the first blow to the initial symmetrical intersubjective exchange of glances between sitter and viewer." And another question, another quote relevant here. "Let us try to imagine how someone with such a head covering, twice the size of his head, would parade around while wearing it. The fact that this evokes an absolutely comical scene reveals the typical way the phallus works. A thing that must conceal its intrinsic impotence, and that is in fact a castrating signifier. A phallus is funny because it can at any moment turn into precisely what it wants to conceal, the potentially implosive nature of the cap. Its fantastic, and therefore fantasized, appearance and its impossible presence on the head of a living being all contribute to making it so. The painter understands how the phallus works and depicts the chaperone in such a way that it cannot be perceived as anything but comical. The showpiece implodes here into what it tries to conceal, and the painter knows that this intrinsically ambivalent and amusing structure is that of the phallus. Van Eyck positions himself with the phallus, but not without alluding to and playing on its inherently ridiculous representation. Is this a painter who is laughing at himself by exhibiting himself as a ridiculous phallus? No one has ever pointed out this intrinsically comical, because phallic, aspect of the chaperone. The reason for this is the historicism governing most interpretations of the painting. This approach excludes the idea that the painter intended the head covering to be droll. Why would he? What strikes us today as excessive was not so for the painter. What seems comical today was certainly not then. Surely the emergence of the self-portrait cannot, after all, be thought to start with a joke. Calling the chaperone a phallus in the psychoanalytical sense captures perfectly the ambivalence of the chaperone, being a false, blown-up gestalt, but in reality an ungestalt, as Dürer would call it, representing symbolic strength, but at the same time collapsing into the comical, the ridiculous. This is essential to understand Van Eyck's art, the essay claims. But let's move on. There are more awkward things happening. We read about the two slightly disconnected eyes and the relative independency of the sitter's left eye. So I read again from an article, a crucial passage following the description of the eyes. The viewer then becomes aware of the strong articulation of the left eye, certainly in comparison with the vaguer right one. Just above it, the far too pronounced temple comes into view via a sort of bridging zone that grows more intense as we return toward the excessively articulated eye. Now we also see it, through the spiral of deep wrinkles and grooves below it, something that the right eye lacks completely, and so more readily attracts the viewer's attention. The viewer now also sees, for the first time, something absolutely remarkable, something that must have always been visible, but that they initially didn't notice, although it is more or less in the middle of the face. A point, or punctum, or, on closer look, a hole, as if this hole was not a trompe-l'œil, but had actually been bored or pricked through the canvas, the hollow beneath it catching the light. The spiraling lines form a vortex, at the center of which is a hole. There, immediately beside the actual eye, At around the same height of the pupil, there is another eye, a blind eye, if you will, and the unthinkable at last becomes visible. There can be no mistake, for what we see here is none other than an arse. I continue the passage. The left eye has pulled away from the right, annihilating itself as an eye in order to lure the viewer into meeting the impossible gaze of an arsehole. Is there a better description of this kind of experience than what Lacan called confrontation with the thing? The thing leaves no opening for a return. The artwork takes over from the viewer. This is what Lacan awkwardly called, for lack of a better term, the gaze, le regard, a term that can only lead to confusion. A kind of view that does not actually see, of course, but only takes away vision, rendering it impossible for the viewer to adopt the same position as before. From now on, this position is determined literally by a black hole in the painting. The portrait seems to be a grandiose concealing circumvention around a misplaced anus that is always able to elude eye contact. Once we have seen this, the rest of the representation also seems to steal things away, to swallow them up. This is an abyss. What is the anus doing here? Why is a towering artist like Van Eyck doing this to us innocent viewers? Could it be that the emergence of the self-portrait, which exchanges glances with the viewer, is impossible without the simultaneous emergence of the black hole, the blind spot that one or another way obscures the mirror image of the artist, and that in turn makes it impossible for us to view it immaculately? At this point, the viewer suddenly grasps that in the formlessness of the temple just above the lost arse, there is the outline of a nude male body, depicted frontally, or rather, something that resembles the torso of the famous Apollo Belvedere, depicting vaguely thighs, genitals, and navel, revealing the imaginative function of the temple. Here I would like to add that Van den Acker loved his closely inspection of the temples of Van Eyck paintings. But once I remember he complained how many of those ambivalent temples were irrevocably damaged because of bad restoration. The location of the temple is in medieval medicine associated with the imagination, recycling what the eye captures into an image. In this sense, the temple operates as a virtual mirror, reflecting what the sitter sees or imagines seeing in front of him, what appears to be a naked male body. Here follows another important passage about the ambiguity of these images and if we accept to see them or not, or rather, why they were not seen for at least 150 years or more. And I quote again, "And yet, perhaps a renewed relationship is possible with the portrait as a whole, even though we have now experienced a shocking impact and its concomitant aftershocks, now that the experience with this work will never be the same again. Let us try to reinterpret the work retroactively, starting from the confrontation with the arts. Let us try to understand something about the artistic operations that the painter is undertaking here, and let us look primarily at how he plays with the positions of the subject who is confronted with the real. What do we see, and what do we want to see? What can we see, and what do we not accept in what we see? I can see it, but nevertheless, I choose not to do so. Sight is possible only for a subject who surrenders his or her privileged position. The power of Van Eyck's work lies in his manipulation of the position of the subject in relation to the signifier. In this way, the painter succeeds in painting the arse that no one sees, just as Edgar Allan Poe once successfully hid a letter by exposing it in plain sight. We also have to wonder what the impact of this thing is. This thing that is, strictly speaking, not something, a hole, a hollow, an impossible and misplaced arse, one that has lost its way, forgotten its organic and symbolic place in the body, a detached arse that has nestled like a parasite next to the obsessive left eye, a third eye, the blind, dark eye of the arse, the eye that does not see but gapes. End of quote. The essay then moves on to show how this can be understood in a context inspired by the 13th century influential literary work, the Roman de la Rose, There is a comparison between anuses in Van Eyck and the Burgundian Decamerone called the Sans Nouvelle, which deconstructs the false comical transgression in the latter and the emancipatory humor of the former, Van Eyck's humor, of course. So here again we have the context of sodomy, but I think an enlightening part will follow. So another quote. The subject that comes to stand eye to eye with the macabre humor of the thing, let us say the person whom this nether eye eyeballs, may be the queer subject, or in the terminology of the late Middle Ages, the sodomite. For Van Eyck, art is by definition a sodomitical matter, the matter of the black hole or the dysfunctional arse. Van Eyck discovers that art is consistent with sexuality, not as an organic, procreative, normative act, but in its problematic aspects, which the 15th century referred to as sodomy. With Van Eyck, one can perceive a remarkable discovery of sexuality, which coincides with the development and expression of his portraiture. This is given expression in nearly all his works, although little or no attention has been paid to the fact in research to date. In my view, we have to regard sodomy as it is depicted in his work, as no longer being equivalent to homosexuality. However, the problematic aspect of sex is more precarious here for socio-cultural reasons than is the case with what is regarded as normative sexuality. Perhaps we can simply call sodomy in Van Eyck's work modern sexuality. The status of the sodomite is ambiguous, complex, and in Van Eyck rehabilitated to achieve an artistic status. Whether Van Eyck was homosexual or a sodomite is not really relevant, assuming it could even be deciphered from this work. Moreover, such a reading would make it endlessly more difficult by an artistic gesture toward realistic fiction or construction that is an intrinsic part of Van Eyck's sodomitical conception of art. What interests me is the meaning of the link between art and sodomy here and what this might signify for art. Further on, I suspect, however, that Van Eyck made his art resonate with sexuality, sodomy, owing to his reading of Alain de Lille and the authors of the Roman de la Rose. For these authors, sexuality is a constantly recurring theme that always appears ambiguous and contradictory. It is primarily the basic ambiguity and contradiction of sexuality that must have inspired Van Eyck to place his painting within this tradition. His art and the way in which sexuality plays a role in it compels us, it seems to me, to reassess the historicist conception of sexuality, and in its wake, artists like Van Eyck's own conception of art. Perhaps the sodomizing of art by Van Eyck can in a sense be seen as a certain desexualization, or at least if we understand sexuality to mean the normative, procreative sexuality of his own time, with its harmonious role play governed by vast cosmic, so-called natural or rational rules. The modern subject appears in Van Eyck's frame with a hole in the subject, but also a rift in the traditional sexual harmony. This traditional cosmic vision is clearly dominant in, for example, Hieronymus Bosch. Bosch's moralism is that of agnostic with a dualistic worldview. In that sense, Bosch was a conservative painter in contrast to Van Eyck. The irony is that the contemporary perception of both painters tends to argue the opposite. That says a great deal about our postmodern and often neo-traditionalistic sexuality, which in many cases represents an ill-conceived return to the idea of a pseudo-natural sexuality. Van Eyck's art is sort of mythical in the sense that there is absolutely nothing natural about it, for sexuality is precisely that which does not line up with the teleology of reproduction, and the same is true of art. Let us stay for a moment with Bosch and his followers. Amongst them we find the traditional reversal by which the back bears the face of a devil or demon. These clearly symbolic procedures of reversal, which have, under the influence of the renowned analysis of Mikhail Bakhtin, been falsely described as emancipatory, are not present in Van Eyck. There is no question of reversal, but of an impossible, aberrant, ambiguous presence in the midst of the face of the symbolic other, which in the case of the self-portrait articulates the other in the self. Let us not forget that the face on the back is a traditional representation that does not liberate the anus as an independent partial object, but instead emphasizes its excreative biological function. The obscene or transgressive nature of this image lies in the fact that it brings the sublime nature of the human face together with the disgusting facial essence of the arse. What Van Eyck does is to emancipate the arse as a partial object and give it a prestigious place next to the most important bodily organ for the painter, the eye. This coordination of the eye and the arse is at the very least, astonishing. The arse, for Van Eyck, is separated from its biological location and function and becomes a signifier that cannot be integrated or symbolized, but stands for impossible, because forbidden, sodomitical pleasure. The dysfunctional arse can, in my view, not be understood in any other way. There is much, much more to read and to understand, and of course, to clarify. It is all in the article, but let's move on to the second painting, Jan de Leeuw. Jan de Leeuw, apparently born on the 21st of October, feast of Saint Ursula in the year 1401. This information was recorded by the artists on the frame in trompe-l'œil, a painted deception that also succeeds in making the viewer believe that the frame was made of copper. Van Eyck used the same technique to paint 4 verses in Middle Dutch in such a way that they appear to have been carved out. Some letters were then adorned with metal, or at least that's what it looks like. The painter spread the 4 verses equally over the 4 sides of the frame. Together they make up a poem that can be read clockwise beginning at the top left corner. What is fascinating is that Van Eyck consistently cited the bottom verse at the top so that the viewer is moved to turn the work around in order to be able to read it easily. And I think I will move a little bit faster, because we cannot go much more into detail, but the essay proposes and reveals in an equally sodomitic reading of this painting. There is the implication of copper connected to sodomy. Of course, also goldsmiths were associated with sodomy, making money from money, which according to Christian morals is an almost miraculous impossibility and a deadly sin called usury. Further, there is the concept of conterfeiten, which connects painting with coining, forging, and of course practices contra naturam. Further, the ring is not just a nice emblem of his trade, but means in classical and medieval culture, of course, the anus or annulus, little anus. This is a very common reading, going back to Ovid, etc. A juicy detail I still want to show you, quoting the article. Anyone who takes a close look and thinks about how the painting would have had to have been turned around in order to be able to read the bottom verse will more clearly see that at 45 degrees to the right, the 2 figures holding the ring look very much like the male torso that we've already seen in the temple of the man with the red turban. So the article goes on to the following conclusion. These portraits are, as has often been said, about the discovery of the ego and the subject and so on, but they are also the simultaneous discovery of the blind spot of and in the subject. And this discovery is also that of sexuality, not something natural or symbolically inscribed in the social order, but precisely something that is absolutely unnatural and precarious as a symbolic inscription, because it is that which escapes whenever talk turns to sex. The sexual is the unconscious, as Freud claims. That this interpretation is correct and can be confirmed by the small, easily overlooked detail that Roland Barthes refers to as the punctum of the work and George Didi Huberman as the zone, patch, fleck. The ring could be an anus, but things are not so simple. Jan de Leeuw's ring is not merely a symbolic anus. A careful viewer will see the punctum. The punctum is not just a crack in the ring, but the fact that the ring is always already cracked, that the ring is itself the crack. In my view, this punctum is a little red stain by the eye of the ring, and which has generally been interpreted as a red gemstone. But if you take a closer look, you can see that it is oddly mirrored by a red stain on the edge of the ring. What is it doing there? Is the painter trying to reflect a sort of crack or break in the ring? Shakespeare had Hamlet say to the young actor who played female roles, "Pray God your voice, like a piece of uncurrent gold, be not cracked within the ring." Hamlet is of course talking about the young boy's voice, which could break at any time during a performance, but the cracked ring is also a reference to anal penetration. Could this round stain indeed be an allusion to the practice of anal sex? Perhaps, but for Van Eyck, things are always more complex. Why does he not paint the broken ring more clearly, if this was his intention? Why does it seem as though there is something not quite right in the depiction of the ring, precisely at the place that is crucial for the correct meaning? Why is this absolute accurate painter suddenly sloppy and evidently unable to clearly represent a gemstone, much less the break or a crack in a ring? Why did he not paint it? Why does he seem suddenly and beyond any realism to add a red stain or two different red stains that on closer inspection are impossible to define? Is this not what Didier Uberman means with the difference between a detail that may be minuscule but can nevertheless through its context have a clear meaning, and a patch, a scratch or a spot without a clear meaning? In my view, the whole portrait of Jan de Leeuw ultimately has no conclusive meaning attached to this little red fleck. It's a flaw in the ring itself, which may be broken. As a reference to the ars and thus to sodomy, the ring itself suffices, and the red fleck does not add much more. At most, it accentuates the meta-position of the ring and thus of sodomy. Sodomy is not a sexual identity, but the problem of sexuality, that which places normative sexuality at the risk. A hole or ring in what is normative. Is this reading hypothetical? By way of conclusion, let us return to an as yet unsolved riddle, that of the points and the crosses that, in my view, are the real message of the poem on the frame, and not the redundant chronograms. Verses 1 and 3 have a similar coding. They are preceded by a cross, and in verse 1, that cross is supplemented by a point. Verses 2 and 4 are only preceded by points, and in verse 2, 3 points, and in verse 4, by 2 points. The code is very simple, in fact, and the touchstone of its correctness is, of course, that it must be applied consistently, so that the meaning of the cross and the points must always and everywhere be the same. The riddle involves an acrostic with certain particularities, namely that the first letter of certain words must be chosen, and that the cross and the point determine the selection of those letters. The cross has two meanings that must apply always and everywhere. The first meaning has to do with its 4 points, so begin with the fourth word. And the second meaning, and thereafter always count the first letter. The point means take the first letter of the word whose position coincides with the number of points. Concretely, cross point means, therefore, begin with the fifth word, cross equals 4 and point equals 1, and count every first letter of the following words. Result, S-O-D. 3 points means take the first letter of the third word, E. Cross means count every letter from the fourth word, M-I. To conclude, sodomy. This form of writing diverges, of course, from the one deciphered on Van Eyck's painting Lael Souvenir, where sodomite is written cryptically in retrograde in Greek letters. Of course, there was no standard form of writing at the time, and in summons from the court of Pamela in 1610, we read enorme crime van sodomy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. We move now immediately to the last speaker, who is Joanna Gomes. Joanna is currently a Pessoa specialist and living in Paris, but she was a very important speaker to have here tonight. She will bring a more personal, beat, quite poetical story about Gerard. So let's say not especially less intense, but a little bit less dense than what you heard before. If you have doubts, which I can guess you have, there is much more on the site. The two articles are, I guess, are they not almost 30 pages or something, both of them? So you have 60 pages to read in these times of staying home a lot and you don't know anymore which series on Netflix you wish to see. Maybe you can just go to the Jan van Eyck website and dive into this weird world that Gerard discovered and we, let's say, expose now for the first time to the public. Joanna, please, it's up to you now.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here, despite the difficult situation. I'm also happy to see many faces that recall the days and nights in Arraiolos with Gerard. Gerard was a good friend and a major inspiration. I'm happy the time has come that his work will return to us and will continue to inspire us. So let me begin. It must have been during the summer of 2015 in Arraiolos when the idea first emerged to preserve Gerard van den Aker's work and to make it more widely known. Barely had we said goodbye to Gerard when we understood that there would be no more Van Eyck summer schools. Like all the previous editions, the last evening of the summer school ended in the village, most participants having stayed on an extra night specially, and we caroused until early hours. Gerard had already left by then. We had our last meeting the following morning. Everyone seemed in a rush, although there was no need. Perhaps it was nervousness about the impending journey home, or the recognition that most of us might never meet again. Or it was the uncomfortable sense of premonition that accompanied the dawning realization that the same thought had slowly but surely descended upon everyone without having been spoken aloud. In any case, the mood at the time was one of forced cheerfulness. As usual, we took stock of the previous 10 days, which also, as usual, had been spent in a kind of unrelenting ecstasy. The daily seminars were chaotic and unstructured. Rooms often had to be changed at the last minute due to planning oversights. Sometimes a 3-hour seminar would decamp to the chapel or the mosteiro, or just outside, in the semi-open cloisters, or amid the cool of the knobbly cork oaks. And sometimes, when we chanced to recall that what propelled us into these days of art historical research, a days constituted by panels, seminars, and shared hypotheses, by fierce philosophical exchanges and even iconological discoveries, was none other than Van den Aker's vision of Jan van Eyck paintings. A sense of unreality would kick in. At the time, we said nothing of a next edition or of Gerard. It seems to us that everything had been said. Only in retrospect would we call the ensuing years Gerard's last dark period. This anecdote should provide a concise introduction to Gerard's peculiar constitution and the paradoxes that govern this exceptional but extremely complex personality. For example, there was no work to speak of. What did we mean when we all agreed that his work should be preserved and passed on? Where should we seek and find it? What could we guard and disseminate, since Gerard's work precisely replicated his seminars, having no beginning or end, but rather amounting to a meandering stream of ideas and connections, building on what was understood only by us, die-hard Ackerites. To us fell the retrospective task, and responsibility of organizing various unofficial meta-seminars to take into the newcomers, stragglers, and slower minds. The strange thing was that, as participants in the seminars at the time, we couldn't have cared less whether or not we could follow what was going on, even less in which direction it would go. In fact, none of the stragglers, so to speak, was even slightly aware of being off track. In short, scant, if any, official publications ever appeared, certainly not in their final version. Gerard never ever finished his dissertation, although we all suspect that he had gone to America especially for this reason. From this American period emerged his so-called Conversation with Colombo, a series of pamphlets based on his lectures, which was released episodically, and little of which, as we now know, has survived, really only a handful of illegible fragments. Colombo was the nickname of a friend of Gerard's in New York. His real name remains a well-kept secret, alas. A cloakroom attendant at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who not only resembled a squinting inspector, the only, perhaps not insignificant difference, curiously, being that Gerard's Colombo did not squint, but also adopted his methods, applying them to philosophy and art. According to Gerard, this Colombo was the actual brains of the museum, the true curator, the one who, just like the real Colombo, always understood everything immediately, and for this very reason acted dumb. Colombo always said, is Socrates turned into a cop. To which Gerard would reply that he was not entirely sure, that he didn't prefer the idea of the reverse hypothesis. Yet, as is often the case with people whose antennae are so sharply attuned that they no longer derive any pleasure from it, Colombo felt more at ease in his cloakroom, where he would explain, several times a day, to the ladies and gentlemen who handed over their coats and cloaks, the mechanics of the curious machine that automatically retrieved them. Such machines are, to my knowledge, also used in the National Gallery in London. However, I am aware of none so old or monumental as the copper version at the Met, which may date back to the 1950s. Colombo regularly mentioned how deeply he regretted that this venerable carousel, which, by the way, is a pure joy to look at, especially when it spins with a motley array of coats, was not a fixture of the museum's guided tours. According to him, this conveyor system was the museum's absolute masterpiece, forgotten, or, he added conspiratorially, perhaps supplanted by the curators. Later, I searched for pictures on the machine, of the machine on the internet, and curiously couldn't find any. This was the first paradox. We constantly talked about Van den Ecker's work, and if it had been chronicled, as if there was another to study. In reality, we ourselves would have to assemble, edit, and reconstruct this other, hitherto existing only virtually in the form of his ideas, which still circulated in his wake. In the hundreds, perhaps even thousands of pages of notes made by seminar participants in arraiolos, in numerous unfinished variations on themes, in so many thousands of sketches by Van den Acker for essays, magazine contributions, and small independent publications. And finally, in his magnum opus, the never completed, seemingly impossible to complete book on Jan van Eyck, the working title of which was on everyone's lips in arraiolos. All of us hoping that Gerard would read, or better yet, paraphrase passages from it, because in doing so he developed a self-commentary driven by an invisible force that had a suspense, often lacking in the unstructured, contextless fragments circulated amongst participants. Fragments which some argued lacked authenticity, or the equally nebulous and notorious Van den Acker touch, being only well-intentioned forgeries aimed at convincing skeptical newcomers or resolute non-believers, who, of course, mingled with the loyal subscribers each and every year and often spoke the loudest, of the progress of the masterpiece, The Sodomite and the Unsightly, which was the name Gerard had settled upon of his own personal arcades project. Let's get to the point. This website is a perpetually in flux e-version of Van den Acker's unfinished book, which the curators hope to present in its entirety in the not-too-distant future. It is also a transitional tool to ever-accumulating status questionis and a paradoxical window onto the world of a mansard scholar whose only windows in life were the paintings he studied. The sole aspect of his work which can be described in relatively straightforward terms is its monomaniacal focus on the 15th century artist Jan van Eyck, however broad and transhistorical his studies were. Gerard was convinced that his obsession, as he openly spoke of his Van Eyck studies, would cost him his life, that Van Eyck would be his downfall, which, he added, would be inevitable with or without Van Eyck. Furthermore, towards the end, he admitted that he no longer knew whether his obsession was purely with Van Eyck or with downfall itself. In any case, Van Eyck and the idea of downfall were the twin obsessions to which everything else was sacrificed. He even went so far as to dub himself denier of all, with the requisite dose of self-derision. Everything, potential publications, lectures, ample at the start, albeit admired less for their content than for the brilliant, idiosyncratic rhetoric with which Van den Acker managed to capture an audience even before beginning to speak, was set aside. Until finally he jettisoned his whole academic career in order to dedicate himself to all-consuming Van Eyck study. The great refusenik, the eternal eliminator, the cursed canceller, he was called by his friends at the time, though the latter inevitably became increasingly sparse on account of the fact that he avoided every seminary, every study group, every conference or colloquium. In short, practically every human encounter. All the more surprising, then, that in 2012 Van den Acker agreed to attend the Van Eyck Summer School in Arraiolos. Without this initiative, there might have been no trace at all of his work, so its importance cannot be overestimated. And without the influence and unwavering insistence of Tim Foubert, whose real name none of us knew until recently, and whom everyone at the time called Durtal, Van den Acker would never have been convinced. It was Durtal who had been providing for Van den Acker for the last 20 years. Although for the time being it is not clear how important a role Durtal played for Gerard, besides offering this material support. What is certain, however, is that Van den Acker could always rely on gaining entry to a second-floor apartment in the historic building which Durtal owned in the center of Bruges, and whose address I am not legally in a position to disclose at present. Van den Acker continuously commuted between Bruges and his hometown Antwerp, making a pit stop in Ghent, where he would sit on the mythic bench in the cloister of St. Bavo's Abbey. After touching Hubert, as he put it, when describing these nigh weekly visits to Hubert van Eyck's weather grave, which he had to feel even more frequently from 2016. Only in 2017, when the house went up in flames, and with it most of Van den Acker's archive, which had meanwhile been transferred to the city, did Durtal finally slip off the cloak of anonymity. The summer school undoubtedly played a pivotal role in saving Gerard's work from obscurity. Such a great quantity of material was collected there between 2012 and 2015 that the destruction of many original documents in 2017 ultimately proved less disastrous for Gerard's œuvre than one might have thought at first. What prompted Durtal to organize the summer school in Arraiolos was initially a mystery, and no credence was given to the idea that it was to do with his regular business trips to the area. Nor can it be attributed to an anecdote Gerard once told concerning an amorous liaison he had in Alentejo, which he sometimes mentioned on balmy nights when only a handful of students and a few drops of bagaço remained, since this dated back to just after the revolution on 1974. Perhaps the reason was far more prosaic, revolving around the fact that Durtal was easily able to secure the cooperation of the local authorities in what is arguably Portugal's oldest artisanal carpet-making hub. Of course, every Van Eyck aficionado knows that the artist himself spent almost 2 weeks in Arraiolos in the company of those Burgundian ambassadors who arrived in Lisbon at the end of 1428 to arrange the future wedding of Duke Philippe the Good and the Infanta Isabella, daughter of the Portuguese king João I and Philippa of Lancaster. In a preserved travelogue of the voyage, one can read in Old French: s'y attendirent en une ville nommée Réols jusqu'au 12e jour de janvier 1429 que le roi les manda de vers lui. Le dit 12e jour de janvier se partirent ceux ambassadeurs du dit Réols. Van Eyck went on to make 2 portraits of the Infanta in Avis, 20 kilometers from Arraiolos, for her future spouse, Philip the Good, who had stayed in Flanders. One was sent by land and the other by sea. The portraits have sadly been lost and are only known to us through a later copy that is kept in Lisbon and which, according to specialists, was the inspiration for the Sibyl of Cumae, figure on the Ghent altarpiece. We know that he maintained solid contact with various artists, including Jan van Eyck, whose vision of art and society he shared. There is an anecdote about Van den Eyck's visit to Verkhuis in London, at a time when his obsession with convex mirrors was flaring up, an obsession which he tried to extinguish with intensive study and writing. We will not dwell on this fiery anecdote here. In Van den Eyck's own words, this fascination for convex mirrors went back to his childhood, a crucial period in his life, much of which he spent in an apartment in the legendary Hotel Palace in Zeebrugge, a building still extant, with no one but his melancholy mother for company. 2 memories are decisive here. The front Art Deco door surrounds above with a written in Middle French, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame on anyone who thinks evil of it, and a small convex mirror in the drawing room, set in a gilded frame scattering excessive light rays. It is here that the young Van den Eyck realizes for the first time that the convex mirror is not a mirror, but an amorphic instrument, and thus an instrument of fantasy. He often seeks refuge by this mirror and loses himself in its distortions. However, the obsession with the convex mirror becomes traumatic when, much later, and now a student of art history in the Netherlands, he seeks to share his memories of it with family members, only for them to obstinately deny any knowledge that such a thing had ever hung in the drawing room. Van den Eyck's interest in Freud also dates to the same period, is that this upsetting exchange with his family confronts him with the repression that can affect subjects themselves, confronted by the deranging curvature of reality. In London, Van den Eyck meets the film director Joseph Losey. then putting the finishing touches to his last film. That same year, 1984, Losey dies. Still, before this event, he has the chance to visit Losey at his house in Chelsea, though he is particularly interested in a house in the other side of the street. 20 years previously, Losey had filmed his masterpiece, The Servant, in this house, a film that Gerard has always connected with Van Eyck, not least because of the convex mirrors that feature in it, but also because he recognizes the deforming effect of mirrors as itself a queer element, an idea he first had upon reading Tlon, Ukbar, Orbis Tertius, a famous story by the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, in which the following quotation attributed to the Gnostics appears on the second page. Mirrors and fatherhood are hateful because they multiply and expand it. The only mirror that is storable is therefore the convex mirror, Van den Acker would say, because in it reproduction is always aberrant and truly monstrous. Is it coincidental that the artist John Murphy, with whom Verkhuis was staying at that time, refers in a recent work to Losey's film Eve, which is set in Venice, with Jeanne Moreau as femme fatale, and Stanley Baker as the artist's writer obsessively in love with her, who confesses that he himself has not achieved anything, but stolen everything from his deceased brother? In our minds, this work undoubtedly draws on the conversation and ideas that Van den Acker, Murphy and Verkhuis exchanged in the 1980s. After all, in an essay of his own, Van den Acker touches on this motive of Losey's, comparing it to Van Eyck's own position vis-à-vis his talented older brother Hubert, to whom he owed everything. According to Van den Acker, this fraternal rivalry manifested itself in Van Eyck's obsession with doppelgangers and in the theme of homosexual, incestuous fratricide, which he portrayed several times. Van den Acker's vision of art was universal. He was firmly against the historicism and culturalism that underpinned mainstream theory in his day. His specific brand of universalism, however, must be understood as that of the crack, of the impossibility, of the exceptional or useless detail in the work of art. Thank you.
Well,
we should keep it short, no?
yeah, we should keep it short. I was just planning to say, wow, I've already had so many questions, and now I've got even more questions.
I have also only questions, in fact. So
yeah.
maybe who is
Okay,
posing the questions?
Okay, yeah. Well, Björn, maybe just to make it short, but I do want to start on a personal note. Do you still recall what the impression, what your first impression was of the thinking of Gerard van den Acker? Which impression made it on you when you first encountered his work and his thinking?
Well, of course, when I met him, when I was a student in Leuven, I had no idea of what he was in fact onto, and that came in fact also only much later when I met other people who also knew him and who met him on the road and so on, and also through my own study, my own interests, it started to become clear that this man had an incredibly impressive legacy that should be preserved. But I think, in fact, it's a little bit this feeling that you have with this kind of Einzelgänger academics, or I don't know, people that are on the side, and in the case of Gerard, it was really a self-chosen destiny that he really wanted to. That what he was always also claiming, that he was also a kind of weird bon vivant, like. He had not. He was austere in one sense, but also he had the kind of grand vivant typology, you can say. So this made that it was not a sad figure at all. On the contrary, and I know maybe we could talk about that later or in private or whatever. In the end, it ended also disastrously. In fact, well, that's also something that we want to more focus on in December because our show, our performance in December, inshallah, let's say, it will be in fact about these more problematic parts of Gerard's own biography and his own life. It's more a sort of almost a biopic on his own, and also we as musicians also, some of us have known him in the end and so on. So this will be more the thematics of. But we found it almost necessary to make this kind of prequel on the performance, and also to we really worked so hard to get it done on the 21st of October because of his own. Of course, his own discoveries on that date. So this date was also very important for him. We forgot even to put this nice bench. We had a nice bench of this where he always sat in the Zimbabwe Abbey. It's like I don't know if it's now there still, but I have an old photo of it, and it was. But we forgot to put it in the PowerPoint. But okay, I think it's even maybe on the website. You can. This is a kind of photo roman on the bio. Yeah.
Okay. I want to ask something more about the focus of his work. Joanna already talked about the Van den Acker touch. Or I'm curious to know what's your take on what sets him apart from other art historians, or what is this touch? Actually, what does it consist of?
Yeah, for people, I think that like myself and I think maybe some people in the well, Bert Timmermans also there, who is also involved in the project and so on. There are some art historians also engaged also that are. In fact, this is a line of thinking which is not so strange. There is the Freudian Lacanian idea. There are the things that come from the school from Louis Marin and Daniel Arras and so on. These kind of, in fact, this is a sort of maybe a little bit anti-historicist way of touching on artworks, and not that they just universalize everything. It's exactly they universalize the weird element in it, and this weird element is the touchstone of everything. In fact, they make this kind of spiraling. It's nice that you have this eye with a spiral, but this spiraling retroactive reading of an artwork, and this is something. Well, in fact, we as musicians do this. We can just not take a musical work and say, it's there on the paper, and now we put it in a kind of MIDI file or a computer, and it comes out in a certain way. No, you have to negotiate with it. And what I find very strong, and I remember, and I think probably Andrew also remembers, and Bert, in these Areolus summer schools, the main element was just to induce to students or young people, or even older, were also older people there, this mentality of almost, I think that's the touch giving to people interested in art, or also art historians, to just dive into these paintings and not be afraid of lack of knowledge, but just really getting well, it's a strange way to say that you get contaminated, no? But in fact, that's the word. He contaminated us, and he contaminated other people with a way of thinking, and this is rare in a certain way. It's because it was also very idiosyncratic. You could not really copy it. We were going sometimes in a line, and he was always already on another line or something. It was kind of so the kind of derive also that he always did or something. So, and that was also sometimes an annoying part of him, that he was never happy to say yes to what you tried to propose. He didn't say really no, but you felt that he had already his mind on other things at that moment. So in this sense also, he was not really he was socially, I think, incapable and impossible to really dive into social institutional research. So he did these things on his own, and well, now it's also I think you, Timothy, were saying this kind of idea that now a collective comes around this work, and we have to work all collectively, because we cannot all find this from ourselves. We need to also we need to also go a lot to notes that were made, seminar notes.
It's practically archaeology or being a detective.
Yeah, these things are really reconstructions.
Yeah.
And so. things can be also interpreted in many ways. There are many influences. Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's mainly his thing. And so for us, it's also, you know, GRAINDELAVOIX, we use a lot imagery. It's not just in the shows, but as an inspiration. How images work. Music is also, in a way, a certain, you can say, sonorous image and so on. And at the same time, there is also this element what I really find interesting for us now, and maybe that's why we took it up. It's almost the political aspect of it. Like, I'm a little bit, and that came also, I think, in your talk, Timothy, when you talked about the royal road of the Panovsky iconology, that idea that you feel how near this goes with kind of idea that Van Eyck is a state painter. Like, he was a guy that obeyed to the state and made paintings which... This is, of course, even a thinking that comes through Foucault, I think. This is the idea of that history is a power system and subjects are overpowered with ideology and so on. They cannot escape from that. And what I like in Gerard's approach is that, wait a minute, is this painter what we think he is? Is this portrait what we think it is? Is it just the inaugural, unprecedented first gaze of a Renaissance man looking at you, very self-conscious, self-fashioning himself, and we lookers also exchanging this gaze? And then you get these ideas that things are not so simple. And in fact, I don't care so much if this is true. I have to laugh with this, of course. I laugh a lot with what comes out. But I don't care so much if it's true. I find interesting that we are forced to look at details we never saw before. And of course, I have to say, an instrument like is now on internet, like this Closer to Van Eyck, this is the major tool. I would say this and that, the Closer to Van Eyck website, this together is the supreme marriage, I think. There you have the two together. But the problem is, it's not just enough to look at pictures. Looking at pictures is not so easy, in fact. And that's what I think this week we got to see. It's very controversial. In fact, looking at pictures, it's a dangerous business. And, well, I say that about polyphony also, of course, but this is something really important that we cannot... that we cannot just leave a painter, Jan van Eyck, to patrimony, to the cultural patrimony that now there is this whole Van Eyck Jaar 21 and so on here in Gent, in Belgium. I don't know. And then also in speeches of politicians, they talk about power, empowering, and use Van Eyck as an example of empowering. I have big problems with that. And I think we should, me as an artist, I feel Jan van Eyck is my fellow artist. I'm here and he's there. I can maybe go on his shoulders, not even, I cannot reach his shoulders. Okay, but in all modesty, I think we need to save sometimes people from the past. That's what Walter Benjamin said once beautifully, that there is this flash, maybe this is Timotheos, for me it's like a flash. I don't care if he was a sodomite or not, but it's interesting to imagine that a painter like Jan van Eyck could have painted one. What should that mean? Even if it's not true, even if it's virtually, or even it's a sort of weird counterfactual that we think, what if we imagine that Jan van Eyck painted Louis Villain, who was burned at the stake in 1432? If that was the case, a kind of like the most marginal figure you can almost be in the 15th century, well, let's say officially. So this is interesting. Also the idea of souvenir as an idea of someone that you have to erase from existence. The name should be, these guys could not have a grave, no? Sodomites they had to be burned also for that reason. There would be no grave for them. So the memory is completely, then there is this beautiful parapet, there is the inscriptions, there is I think you said that also one moment, that there was this screaming, the screaming of the parapet confronted with the silence of the figure portrayed. I think there is no more to say. For me, this is what Gerard was into. And okay, it would be nice now. In fact, I'm so happy that now we open this and that I'm so curious what will happen now. How will this be accepted or not? How will the reactions be? I am very curious to the reactions. I don't think we will get a lot of reactions, as I already know now as an artist that you don't always get so much reactions. You don't know also if you get... But it's just interesting to put this, I think you said it also in the beginning, no? It's a sort of a trigger, or how did you call it in your, when you started, you said something about it's just to
illuminate,
shake up things
to
a little
illuminate,
bit.
the thinking
and
of.
I think for me, culture and art are about shaking up things. I think the role it's not only a Nestbeschmutzer, as they say in German, but also a shaking. You have to shake up things. So now we shake up a little bit with this project. With, let's say, we are using Gerard to shake up Jan van Eyck. Why not? I think it's what every painter of the past, every artist of the past needs to be shaken up.
Yeah. And just to have an impression, now we had 2 articles enlightened. How much else material is there? What's
well, I have to look to our archivist there, but I think we have at least almost like, we have now like almost 50, I'm not kidding, 50 titles, which are like titles where we all collect all the materials, and so we have 50 items that could become 50 texts, like, let's say. That's a little bit the aim. Maybe after 4 texts we will fight with each other or whatever, or there is already no money, so that we cannot fight for the money. That's already a great thing. Maybe we have, from zooming, from too much zooming, you can also get difficulties, maybe social difficulties. But or with us, in fact, it's better with Zoom, no, Bert? We can talk even better. No, okay, but.
Yeah, okay, plenty of material coming up. Then, maybe. But one important question, you already hinted to it, the title, Dark Van Eyck. Please explain why this title.
I think it's also explained somewhere on the thing. That, of course, the idea comes from one of the major ideas of Gerard, which is that idea of camouflage also, that in fact the darkness is not hidden. So it's not the darkness of Caravaggio, who is really painting black, and then out of the black emerges a face. But of course it's a trick, because it's black and you can just put some little highlights and you have a face already. So the black is first. That's not with Van Eyck at all the case. So the problem is, of course, is there then blackness in Van Eyck? Most people say, no, of course not. It's a joyful painter who was a very good state servant, and he made nice pictures of what the patrons asked him. Well, Dark Van Eyck is saying, no, it's not like that. It's much more complicated, and there are weird things there out. And if you go closer to Van Eyck, this is just a beginning. You have now to go all. I mean, the people will be very happy if closer to Van Eyck that I make all this publicity. But anyhow, it's a website where you can dive in for weeks, for months, and you discover interesting things. So it's a much more complex writer. And why dark also? Because it's also not the darkness of Jérôme Bosch or something, where you get a kind of dualistic view. It's not like there are good people and there are bad people, and these paintings are there just to make bad people good. If you listened well to Andrew's talk about the Timotheus, for example, if you take it serious, something weird is happening. And even with the ass on the portrait, it's not just an obscenity. In fact, Van Eyck is never obscene. He's never vulgar. He's never just dark and white or black and white. It's a very complicated painter. It's therefore one of the greatest painters, because he can show everything and you don't see it. This is the master. When you see things, okay, you see everything. But this man, and that's, of course, it has to do with seduction, with trick. I think this term that also was used, the trickster, the idea of the trickster figure, the one that, it's like a magician, in fact. It's someone that I put my hand up, everybody will look here, and then, in fact, there it happens. And because you do this, you can easily put it there for 500 years, nobody will see it. And that's the amazing thing, and that's something what we have also put an item, I don't know if did we put this method now there? Is it there, the method? I know, there will still come we had this plan also to make a distillation of all the articles and of the operational modus of Van Eyck, the modus operandi of Van Eyck, and merge them a little bit with the one of Gerard, to get out, to filter a method. What is the method of this painter? How is he doing this? And it's not about how is he, maybe, I think that's also somewhere that Gerard said it. He said always, it's not an optical, he didn't say it in these terms, but something like that. It's not an optical revolution, it's a sodomitical revolution. And what did he mean with that? Gerard meant that it was not about optical realism as such. It's not about we discover reality and now we paint it. No. In fact, he was the first guy who knew that the best way to fantasize reality is to really paint it. And only through painting and through realistic, optical realist painting, you can paint the ambivalence, you can paint ambiguity. So in fact, what we have to the track I think we are going, and I think it's the track we are trying to go with the whole project, is this track of let's forget about optic realism. I think everything is said about that. I don't want to shock people now about this. Maybe there are many things, of course, still to say. It's a boutade. But I think we need to discover beyond optic realism, beyond the anecdotal of the paintings. It's about how is this done, that meaning is complex, ambiguous, and after 500 years, we still don't know what's happening. And it's not just, oh, it's really well painted, you know, that's too cheap for me, even if it's incredibly well painted, the best maybe. Sorry.
No, that's what makes Van Eyck such a revolutionary or modern painter.
I think that's the point. Yeah, I think he's modern in this sense of ambiguity. He's the first one. Therefore, I love this idea that sodomy could be through Van Eyck seen. I think we should now talk maybe with all the queer students and all the queer faculties and so on. The idea that sodomy I don't know if this is even valuable historically, but that sodomy could be seen through how Van Eyck eventually maybe portrays it or paints it. It could be seen as the first moment of modern sexuality. I mean, not the traditionalistic cosmic gender, you know, all these kind of cliches about what sexuality is, but sexuality as a problem we are stained with, and we don't know. We don't know. I wanted almost to say something that I'm not allowed because it will be from YouTube taken off. That it's a sexuality which is problematic and which is. So I think we need to make this marriage of. This kind of strange. I talk so much about marriage now, but in this context.
Okay, I think we end here. I want to thank you, Björn.
I think we have to thank you that you are so crazy to get us here with this. We are in residency here in the Bijloke, so this is only the beginning. In the end, I don't know, maybe we'll get everybody away from this.
More than welcome.
Anyhow, thank you so much.
If there are any questions, we have 5 minutes. I think that's too less, maybe for one question. Is somebody very eager to ask? Is there a contact,
Facebook, so also
file on the
there is a
website?
Facebook, and I think the mails can be sent. I think Willem, you made a Facebook also, no? So there is. You can all put your hate mails on that, personal things, whatever you want. I don't promise to answer on everything, but I will promise to answer almost on everything.
Okay, we keep you on that. Thank you very much. Dank u wel, dames en heren.
Masks on.